Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." You feel the weight of those words when you sit alone at night, scrolling through the fragments of your day, wondering if you spent your time wisely or simply let it slip. Modern life teaches you to push death out of sight, to numb yourself with busyness, entertainment, and noise. But deep down, you know it waits for you, unavoidable, silent, impartial, and it terrifies you. Not just because of the end itself, but because of what it reveals, all the things you left undone, unsaid, unlived. The Stoics were different. They did not flinch when speaking about death. They looked it in the eye, not with cold detachment, but with clarity and calm. To them, death was not a shadow to hide from, but a teacher to learn from. They believed that by remembering death, you remember life more vividly. You stop wasting your days in trivial pursuits and start aligning yourself with what truly matters. This is where Stoicism becomes more than philosophy. It becomes a medicine for your wounded spirit. It offers you a way to face what you fear most without collapsing under its weight. As you walk through these teachings, you will discover how to turn death, the greatest of anxieties, into the greatest of guides. You will see why the Stoics embraced mortality not to escape life, but to finally live it with unshakable calm. Part 1. Memento Mori. Remember you must die. When you hear the phrase Memento Mori, remember you must die, your first instinct might be resistance. Why would anyone want to dwell on death? Isn't it morbid, even depressing? Yet for the Stoics, this reminder was not about despair, but about sharpening the way you live. It was a compass pointing you back to what truly matters whenever you felt lost in distraction or pettiness. Epictetus. Born a slave and later one of Stoicism's greatest teachers, often spoke of each day as a gift. He urged his students to approach the morning as though it were given to them freely, without any promise of another. When you rise, he said, you do not know if you will live until nightfall, and when you lay your head to sleep, there is no guarantee you will wake again. To remember death was not to shrink away in fear, but to treat each moment as precious and alive. You begin to see how easily you take things for granted. The cup of coffee in your hand, the voice of a loved one, the chance to create something meaningful. When you think these things will last forever, you dismiss them. When you realize they could vanish tomorrow, they suddenly shine. Centuries later, this same principle guided one of the most influential voices of our time, Steve Jobs, in his 2005 commencement address at Stanford. Jobs shared the philosophy that had shaped his boldness as a creator and risk-taker. He told the graduates, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. He did not mean it as a cliché. Jobs lived through the brutal confrontation of cancer, and with it came a crystal clarity. When you truly understand that your time is short, you stop wasting it living someone else's life. You strip away fear of embarrassment, fear of failure, even fear of disapproval, because those fears look so small compared to the inevitability of death. What remains is urgency. What remains is freedom. Modern psychology confirms this ancient wisdom. Researchers in what is known as terror management theory have shown that when people are reminded of their mortality, they often shift their values and behaviors. This awareness, called mortality salience, can trigger anxiety, yes, but it can also inspire a deep reorientation. If you let it, the reminder of death can push you to live with greater integrity. It can help you align with your true self rather than being enslaved to the expectations of others. When you know the clock is ticking, suddenly the approval of strangers, the endless pursuit of status, the petty grudges, these no longer hold the same weight. Death strips away illusions and exposes what is essential. You may resist thinking about your own mortality, yet avoiding it does not protect you, it weakens you. When you refuse to confront death, you live in a fragile bubble. easily shaken by every reminder of life's impermanence. A friend's illness, a sudden accident, even a birthday milestone can throw you into panic because you have not built the muscles to face the truth. But when you practice Memento Mori, you inoculate yourself. You rehearse, not in despair but in gratitude, the reality that every day is borrowed time. And in that rehearsal, fear loses its grip. Consider for a moment your own life. Think of one thing you keep postponing because you assume there will always be time. Maybe it's calling your parents, writing the book in your head, taking that trip with your children while they are still young. Now imagine, honestly, that you may not have another year to do it. Would you wait, or would you act? This is the power of Memento Mori. It cuts through procrastination and perfectionism and demands you choose now. The practical step for you is simple. Though not easy, set aside one moment each day to remind yourself of death. You can do this in the morning by whispering to yourself, "This day is a gift. It could be my last." Or at night, as you lay down to sleep, acknowledge the truth that not everyone who closed their eyes today will wake tomorrow. Let this thought not burden you, but liberate you. Let it help you pour your energy into what matters: acts of love, meaningful work, presence in the small details of life. When you adopt this Stoic lens, you stop asking, "How much time do I have left?" and start asking, "What will I do with the time I have now?" The first question feeds fear, the second feeds purpose. And purpose is what the Stoics and the wisest among us understood as the antidote to the fear of death. Part 2: Stoic courage, death as nature, not enemy. When you think of death as a catastrophe, you give it power over you. This is how most of society has trained you to see it: an enemy to fight, an intruder that steals what you love. Yet the Stoics urged you to shift your perspective. To them, death was not a calamity, but part of the natural rhythm of existence. Just as dawn gives way to dusk and summer fades into autumn, so too does life eventually give way to death. It is not unfair, they would remind you. It is simply what is. Seneca, writing to his friends and students, often returned to this point. In one of his letters, he spoke about dying with a serene spirit, not clinging desperately to what could no longer be held. He encouraged you to look at death not as a punishment, but as the conclusion of a performance. Life is like a play, he wrote. It's not the length, but the excellence of the acting that matters. The actor who knows the curtain will fall is not broken by it. He strives to play his role with dignity until the end. To live with the constant thought of death is not to sour your days, but to strengthen your courage. This courage is not about arrogance, nor about ignoring the pain of dying. It is about facing what cannot be avoided with calm acceptance. When you accept that death is natural, you are no longer a slave to the fear of it. You become free to focus on how you live rather than how you will die. In our own time, one of the clearest examples of this Stoic courage was Chadwick Boseman, the actor beloved for his role as Black Panther. For years, Boseman battled a private war with cancer, enduring surgeries and treatments while the world saw only his brilliance on screen. He did not announce his illness, did not seek sympathy, did not let the shadow of death define him publicly. Instead, he poured himself into his craft, delivering performances filled with strength and inspiration. Even as his body weakened, his art uplifted millions. His choice was not denial, but dignity. He understood, like the Stoics, that death could not take away what was essential: his character, his contribution, his courage. Think of what it takes to live that way. To know that your time is short and yet continue giving, creating, and serving without making your suffering the center of attention. Boseman embodied the very thing Seneca described: a quiet, unshaken acceptance of mortality coupled with a deep commitment to live fully until the last breath. His life reminds you that courage in the face of death is not measured by how loudly you declare it, but by how steadily you live it. Modern psychology supports this as well. When people avoid death, treating it as an unthinkable subject, they often experience more anxiety, more panic, and more denial at the end. But those who integrate the truth of mortality into their lives develop resilience. This is sometimes called death acceptance. Studies have found that individuals who cultivate a sense of acceptance, whether through philosophy, spirituality, or reflection, face their final moments with less fear and greater peace. They recognize death as a part of life's cycle, not an interruption of it. You can practice this courage in small ways long before your final day comes. Each time you encounter loss, a season ending, a friendship drifting, a plan failing, you can remind yourself that change and conclusion are woven into the fabric of nature. By embracing these smaller endings, you prepare your spirit for the larger one. You train yourself to see that what departs is not an injustice but a natural passing. So what can you do in your daily life? Begin by noticing how you talk about death. Do you call it unfair, tragic, unnatural? Try shifting your language. Speak of it as a part of the whole, as natural as breathing. When a flower wilts, you do not call it a catastrophe. When a leaf falls in autumn, you do not rage against it. Why then, when a human life reaches its conclusion, do you imagine it must be otherwise? This reframing, practiced gently and consistently, builds in you a stoic courage that no shock can shake. When you stop fearing death as an enemy, you reclaim your energy for living. You stop wasting your spirit in resistance and instead invest it in presence. You become like Bosman, like Seneca, aware of the end, yet unbroken by it. And when the time comes, you can step forward with calm dignity, knowing you have lived as part of nature, not apart from it. Part 3: Death sharpens the way we live. There is a certain clarity that comes only when you remember how fragile life really is. The Stoics believed that the constant awareness of death was not a morbid obsession but a powerful lens. It strips away what is trivial and leaves only what is essential. When you live as though tomorrow is promised, you drift into distraction and delay. But when you recognize that each breath could be your last, you suddenly see what deserves your attention: death. Far from being only an end, sharpens life into focus. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, reminded himself each day of this truth. In his meditations, he wrote the line that has echoed across centuries: "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, say, think." Imagine carrying those words into your daily choices. How would you speak to your family if you knew it could be the final conversation? How would you spend your afternoon if you knew this was the last one granted to you? Marcus did not intend this reflection to paralyze you with dread, but to awaken you. By remembering that time is fleeting, you are called to use it with care. This is not just ancient philosophy, it is something you see vividly in modern life, especially in moments of crisis. Consider the experience of an ICU doctor during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each shift brought them face to face with death. Patients who had been laughing with family one day and gasping for breath the next. Surrounded by fragility, these doctors carried a perspective that most people avoid. One physician described how the constant nearness of death changed the way they saw their own life. After hours of fighting for patients in intensive care, they returned home, and suddenly the simplest things glowed with meaning. Dinner with loved ones, the warmth of sunlight through the window, even the mundane rhythm of folding laundry became precious. The proximity of death had sharpened their vision. Life's small, overlooked details became treasures, precisely because they knew how quickly they could vanish. You may not walk daily through a hospital ward, but you too can learn from this perspective. Awareness of mortality can pull you out of autopilot and back into the immediacy of your existence. It teaches you that scrolling endlessly through distractions, holding grudges, or postponing dreams are luxuries you do not truly have. Time is not guaranteed. And when you allow that reality to sink in, not as a passing thought but as a living practice, you begin to prioritize differently. You choose presence over procrastination, depth over busyness, love over pride. Modern psychology echoes this Stoic insight. Studies on mortality awareness show that when people are gently reminded of their finite lives, they often make choices that are more aligned with their deeper values, instead of chasing superficial goals. They invest in relationships, creativity, and experiences that bring authentic fulfillment. The reality of death can act like a filter, sifting out what is shallow and revealing what endures. In this sense, death is not an enemy of life, but its great clarifier. Ask yourself, what in your life right now is truly worth the limited time you have? And what, if you are honest, is stealing your days without giving anything meaningful in return? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are the ones that sharpen your life. Marcus Aurelius would remind you not to put off becoming the person you are capable of being. The ICU doctor would remind you that one ordinary dinner could be a miracle if you see it with the right eyes. Both voices call you to the same truth, to live as though your days are numbered because they are. The practical step for you is simple. At the end of today, pause and reflect. If this had been your last day, what would you wish you had done differently? Then take that answer and let it shape tomorrow. This reflection is not meant to fill you with regret, but to guide you with clarity. Death has always been the great teacher, not because it ends life, but because it awakens you to live more fiercely, more honestly, more gratefully. When you embrace mortality in this way, you no longer drift through your days as though they are endless. You touch life more directly, love more deeply, and forgive more freely. Death, when remembered, becomes not a shadow, but a light that sharpens every detail of your brief, extraordinary existence. Part 4. Modern heroes who faced death with dignity. It is easy to think of Stoic courage and death as something ancient, locked away in the pages of old philosophy or distant emperors' journals. Yet the essence of Stoicism is timeless. It is a human response to the universal fact of mortality. If the philosophy is true, it must appear not only in old Roman courts or Greek lecture halls, but also in the struggles of people you recognize today. And indeed, it does. Stoic courage is not a relic. It is alive in the stories of modern heroes who confronted death with dignity and turned it into a source of strength, not weakness. Take the story of Malala Yousafzai. In 2012, at just 15 years old, Malala was targeted and shot by extremists for daring to go to school and speak out for the education of girls in Pakistan. She was left critically wounded, her life hanging in the balance. To face death at such an early age is something almost unimaginable. Yet what is remarkable about Malala is not only that she survived, but how she chose to live after staring so directly into death's face. She did not retreat into silence or live in fear. Instead, she transformed the experience into fuel for her mission. She became a global advocate for education, eventually winning the Nobel Peace Prize. When she speaks, you can sense the clarity that comes from having already faced the worst. In Stoic terms, she embodies the principle that death itself cannot dictate your spirit, only you can. Malala chose to live not as a victim but as a messenger, her voice sharper and her mission stronger because she had walked through the shadow of death and refused to be broken. Her story reminds you that courage is not just in enduring your own mortality, but in transforming it into service for others. The Stoics often spoke of living in accordance with nature, which included contributing to the larger human community. Malala demonstrates this. Her brush with death did not shrink her life but expanded it. She embraced the finiteness of her own existence as a reason to make a lasting impact. Another powerful example comes from Terry Fox, the Canadian athlete whose name has become synonymous with perseverance. In 1977, at the age of 18, Terry was diagnosed with bone cancer, and doctors were forced to amputate his leg. Imagine the crushing weight of that news at such a young age, the loss of a limb, the loss of the dreams he had for himself, and the knowledge that cancer was still threatening his life. Yet rather than surrender, Terry chose a path that would astonish millions. He began what he called the Marathon of Hope, running across Canada with a prosthetic leg to raise awareness and funds for cancer research. Day after day, in pain and fatigue, he pressed on. Though the cancer eventually returned and cut his journey short, his run sparked a movement that continues decades later, raising billions of dollars worldwide. In Terry's story, you see the Stoic ideal of turning suffering into virtue. He did not deny death, he lived with its reality in his body every day, but he refused to let it define his spirit. Seneca wrote that the measure of life is not its length but its quality, and Terry Fox embodied this truth. His life was short, but it was wide in impact. He lived, as the Stoics advised, not fearing the end but using what time he had as material for courage and service. What unites Malala and Terry is this: they did not treat death as a barrier but as a clarifier. For Malala, the brush with mortality clarified her purpose as an activist. For Terry, the certainty of limited time clarified his mission to inspire and contribute. Neither story is about perfect fearlessness. Both must have felt the raw terror of mortality, but about choosing dignity over despair. And these are not the only stories. Think too of artists, musicians, or everyday people who live with terminal diagnoses and yet find ways to express joy, to create beauty, to love more fiercely. Their names may never reach the headlines, but in them you see the same quiet stoicism. A parent with a terminal illness who spends their final months writing letters for their children to read after they are gone. A teacher who continues to pour into their students even as treatments weaken their body. These acts may not make the news, but they echo the same truth. Courage in the face of death is not confined to philosophy books. It is lived by real people every day. Modern psychology calls this post-traumatic growth, the way that profound adversity, even the brush with death, can catalyze deeper meaning, greater appreciation for life, and stronger purpose. Where trauma often leaves scars, it can also awaken resilience. This is the very dynamic the Stoics saw. What threatens to destroy you can become the very thing that strengthens you if you choose to face it with courage and clarity. Now pause and reflect. What do these modern heroes teach you? Malala teaches you that death can sharpen your voice and mission. Terry Fox teaches you that mortality can be a catalyst for service and inspiration. Everyday unsung heroes teach you that dignity is not about the length of your life, but the way you choose to live it. Their lives mirror the Stoic conviction that you do not control how long you live, but you do control how well. So how can you bring this lesson into your own life? You may not face threats from extremists or run across a country with cancer, but you face smaller reminders of mortality all the time. Each time you confront an ending, a failed plan, an illness, a loss, you stand at the same crossroads. You can shrink or you can transform. You can treat the awareness of death as a thief or as a teacher that sharpens your focus on what matters most. The next time you feel the weight of fear about the future, remember Malala, remember Terry, remember the countless unnamed who chose courage instead of despair. Let their examples remind you that death need not rob you of dignity. On the contrary, facing it squarely can unlock the fullest expression of who you are. In the end, the Stoic lesson comes alive in the modern world not through abstract theories but through flesh and blood. Malala's voice, Terry's footsteps. The countless acts of courage you may never hear about, they all whisper the same truth: death is inevitable, but dignity is a choice. And when you choose dignity, you not only face death without fear, you live life with unshakable calm. Part 5: Stoic Practices to Overcome the Fear of Death. You've heard the philosophy, you've seen the examples, but how do you in your ordinary life actually face death without fear? The Stoics never intended their wisdom to remain abstract. For them, philosophy was practice, a way of living, something you return to every day like an exercise for the soul. If you want to stand calmly before mortality, you must train your mind and spirit, just as you train your body. Here are practices the Stoics left us, practices you can begin today. The first is negative visualization. At first, this may sound harsh. Why would you imagine losing the people or things you love? But the Stoics believed that by rehearsing loss in your mind, you protect yourself from being crushed when life inevitably takes something away. Seneca advised reflecting on the fragile nature of all that you hold dear, not to darken your mood, but to brighten it with gratitude. Imagine for a moment that this evening might be the last dinner with your family. How much more attentively would you listen? How much more gently would you speak? Imagine that tomorrow your job, your home, or even your health might be gone. Instead of despair, such reflection awakens appreciation. Modern psychology echoes this in the practice of gratitude. When you acknowledge the impermanence of blessings, you savor them more deeply. By practicing negative visualization, you inoculate yourself against loss, but more importantly, you learn to love what you have while you have it. A second practice is daily reflection. Marcus Aurelius modeled this habit in his private writings, which we now know as the Meditations. He often asked himself how he would act if today were his last. This is not a question to depress you, but to direct you. Each morning you might pause and write in a journal, "If this were my final day, how would I live?" Write not in vague ideals, but in concrete choices. Would you spend more time with your children? Would you make that difficult phone call and reconcile with someone you've been avoiding? Would you waste less energy on resentment or meaningless distraction? By asking this question daily, you orient yourself toward action instead of procrastination, toward presence instead of delay. Psychology calls this mortality salience. But you don't need technical terms to feel its power. You simply need to face the mirror of your own impermanence and let it shape how you show up today. The third practice is what the Stoics might call an acceptance ritual. Death cannot be controlled, and much of what leads to it lies beyond your reach. But you can cultivate the inner posture of acceptance, what they called Amor fati, the love of fate. Each day, set aside a moment, perhaps in the morning or before sleep, to breathe deeply and whisper these words to yourself: Amor fati, I love my fate. This does not mean you love every pain or loss for its own sake. It means you embrace life in its entirety, without resisting what you cannot change. By repeating this ritual, you train your mind not to flinch when life surprises you, but to accept with calm dignity what comes. Neuroscience even suggests that such rituals of acceptance reduce stress and increase resilience. By combining breath with affirmation, you anchor yourself in peace. To see how these practices work in real life, picture a parent who decides to spend just 10 extra minutes each night with their child. Perhaps they read an extra story or simply sit and talk before bed. This parent has realized through Memento Mori that time is finite. Instead of assuming endless tomorrows, they invest in today. Those 10 minutes may not seem like much, but over weeks and years they become a legacy of love. The parent has used the awareness of death not to fall into despair, but to deepen life. That is the heart of Stoicism, transforming fear into presence, loss into gratitude, mortality into meaning. Now ask yourself, how might you weave these practices into your own life? Could you take a few moments each morning for negative visualization, not to frighten yourself, but to sharpen your gratitude? Could you set aside time for daily reflection, writing down one thing you would do differently if this were your last day? Could you establish your own acceptance ritual, breathing deeply and affirming your love for fate? These are not grand, dramatic actions. They are small, steady disciplines, but over time they reshape how you face both life and death. The fear of death does not vanish overnight. It lingers at the edges of your mind, whispering what you stand to lose. But when you live with these practices, you begin to soften its voice. You do not deny the reality of death. You meet it with preparation, courage, and calm. You walk into each day not guaranteed another, but grateful for this one. And that gratitude is what transforms the fear of dying into the art of living. To accept death is to live free. Seneca once wrote, "He who has learned how to die has unlearned how to be a slave." Those words capture the essence of the Stoic path. When you stop trembling before death, you stop living in chains. Fear no longer dictates your choices. You no longer postpone your dreams, avoid risks, or waste days in resentment. Instead, you stand free because the worst that can happen has already been accepted. To embrace death is not to be morbid. It is not to walk around expecting tragedy at every corner. It is to live more fully, more awake, more deliberate. When you know your time is finite, you become careful with your hours. You choose presence over distraction, forgiveness over bitterness, action over delay. Each moment becomes precious because you finally see it for what it is, a gift, not a guarantee. The Stoics remind you that life's brevity is not a curse but a compass. It points you toward what truly matters: love, integrity, and courage. Once you accept death, you no longer waste your life trying to avoid it. You begin to live with a kind of fearless gratitude, one that radiates into everything you do. So the real question is not whether you will die, because you will. The question is, how will you live knowing tomorrow is not promised? That is the wisdom Stoicism offers, and it is the challenge life itself presents. And now I ask you, how would you live if you knew tomorrow was uncertain? Share your reflections in the comments below, because by speaking your answer, you begin to live it.